Today on The State of Us, the debt ceiling. It's on everybody's mind again. But what if we abolish the debt ceiling to fix America's debt problem? Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined today by our friendly redneck liberal, Lance Jackson. And could we use the debt ceiling to reduce the debt? Well, isn't that kind of what it's for? But does it work that way? The answer is, I think, as many of us would say, no, because we are again talking about increasing it. And it seems that about 90+% of the time, when we encounter the debt ceiling, the only reasonable answer is to increase it. So are there better answers? And also, let's talk about setting the facts right? What is the debt ceiling? How big is it? How has it changed over the years? And how have the parties, Republicans and Democrats, dealt with it? We've got a full docket today, but of course we couldn't get started until we learn what the word of the day is.
You know, it's interesting when we talk about debt because, if you've listened to the show, I don't like debt. I don't like it personally. I don't, if you can't afford it, you shouldn't have it, and don't get yourself in trouble by being in debt. But got a question for you. Is the debt ceiling just a bauble of the U.S. government? That is our word of the day, bauble, B-A-U-B-L-E. It is a noun. It means a showy but worthless or useless thing. A bauble. So is the debt ceiling just a bauble of the U.S. government? Is it really just a useless number that we throw out there that really doesn't do anything, doesn't do any good, doesn't serve any purpose, but it's something showy that we can talk about and politicize and create partisanship and divide the country even further? If that's the reason why we have it, if it is just a showy trinket, then let's get rid of it if it's not serving any purpose.
Well, and the original intent, behind the debt ceiling was, let's set a maximum amount. For those that don't know, the United States debt ceiling is basically a legislative limit on the amount of national debt that can be incurred by the United States Treasury, thus limiting how much money the federal government may pay on the debt that they already borrowed. And you might say, but doesn't it deal with new lending as well? Well, sort of, but really, remember, we already have a bunch of debt from many, many years past, and we have to make payments on that debt, right? Well, as many of us know, we operate as a country at a deficit, right? We spend more than we are bringing in.
Well, now we always haven't though, right? It's just because we have for so long, doesn't mean we have to. It's not like it's been that way forever. And since, the incarnation of time, and not even as recently as the 20th century, we weren't operating with all of this debt. And people were appalled if a government official argued the fact that, we should be in debt. So this is not always the way it's been. And so we can change it if we want. To me, the debt ceiling, is it just an arbitrary number that people pick and say, okay, because there doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason. 20 years ago, there was this big push with the Republicans, the conservative, the tax people, that we're going to cut taxes and we're going to cut the debt and we're going to have balanced budgets. And those same people during the Trump administration continued to raise the debt. And now the Democrats are in charge, and now, we're not going to raise the debt anymore. Well, it's like, come on, folks. Do you believe in the debt or not believe in the debt? That's kind of where I am.
Yep.
That's the conversation that I want to have, because obviously when the Democrats were in charge, you were against the debt. And when you're in charge, it was okay to have debt, which we've got some interesting numbers there that the research department came up with, right, about who raises the debt limit more. Is it the Republicans or is it the Democrats? And it surprised both of us, and it may surprise you as well. But it's like, can we just agree on whether or not there should be debt, or do we want to pay down the debt?
And to the point and history of the debt ceiling, right? I think mainly the intention was, we want to do something to control the debt, but we can't really figure out what it would be that we're all comfortable with. So we're going to set this arbitrary limit that at times, will just have to be changed, but we're not going to have to deal with that, the people who instituted the debt ceiling, so it doesn't matter to us. And you might say, it's not really arbitrary, right? Because I mean, this whole notion of limiting how much debt you can have, that makes sense. That, what I just said, yes, limiting how much debt you can have, that does make sense. Simply setting a number, that does not make sense. And here's why, right? This is the big thing to understand. There's changes over time, right, to how much our nation produces and what our needs and wants are as a country. And in other words, right, if we increase our GDP by 30%, the debt limit is still whatever it is, right? There's no change. Likewise, if GDP decreases by 30%, well, debt limit's still what it was. So, you can still borrow just as much, even though you're making 30% less. So the whole point is it's arbitrary because we tie it to a given number, right? A set, whatever, 30 trillion, right? I mean, whatever it is at the time, we just set a number and say, well, that's the debt ceiling limit, which is bad for both reasons. It's bad, right, because it can't flex to go higher when we make more money. And it's also bad because there's no reduction on it when we are not making as much money. It's just the same number no matter what's happening in the world.
And very, very loosely, right, the GDP, the gross domestic product, would be equivalent to a family's income. When banks look at your financial situation, they account for how much money you're making in and how much debt you're in as to how much money they can loan you. And that's kind of what Justin's saying here, is that this arbitrary number, this bauble that we have out there called the debt ceiling, it could be tied to the GDP. If as a country we produce more goods, therefore making more money, then we can raise the debt ceiling. If we don't, then we can't, right? Because that would kind of go with the flow of the way all of us live our personal lives.
Yeah, the debt ceiling is a bauble, right? It's just for show.
So can we afford 30 trillion? Well, that's not part of the discussion. It's just,
right.
Should it go up or not go up? Nobody's discussing whether or not we can afford a $30 trillion national debt.
And really, that's what we're talking about. The debt ceiling hasn't had the intended effect. Since 1944, when the debt ceiling essentially went into action, it has been changed approximately 107 times. That's 97 increases and 10 decreases. If the debt ceiling was really a reflection of where we want to be as a country on debt, that number would probably be closer to half and half, right? We would raise it sometimes, we would lower it sometimes. It wouldn't be, well, we'd raise it 90+% of the time and lower it every now and again whenever we get lucky. I mean, that's really not serving the idea of what the debt ceiling should be. Essentially, it's been raised about 56 times by Republicans and about 42 or 3 times by Democrats.
The tax and spend Democrats don't raise the debt ceiling as often as Republicans do.
That's right. Yeah, I was going to say, I just wanted to reiterate to people, I didn't mess that up. That's the Republicans have raised the debt ceiling more than Democrats have raised the debt ceiling.
And when we say Democrats and Republicans, we mean Republican presidencies.
And interestingly enough, now I just want everybody to take a minute before I tell you this, okay? Because I think it's really important. You're going to send us an email. That's what you're about to do. You're about to submit your guess for which president, right, of all time has increased the debt ceiling the most. And this is not, okay, this isn't open for debate. It's not a discussion about, well, who really, no, it's just what is, okay? That's all there is. Now, you might not like it. You might not know who it was, but I guess I'm not surprised now that I know who it is. I was kind of surprised when you first find out who it is. And it's like, really? So who do you think it is? Send us an email, podcast@thestateofus.org, podcast@thestateofus.org. And the person, Lance, is pretty much your favorite president, right? I think of all time. And that'd be Ronald Reagan. Good old President Reagan increased the debt ceiling 18 times during his administration. So that's a few increases.
Almost twice a year, more than twice a year, because he was a 2-term president. Yeah. And you were facetious, I think, right, when you said he was one of my favorites. But he's the modern icon, or was, of the Republican Party until Donald Trump came, and everybody based everything off of what would Reagan have done. And so it's interesting that obviously the debt ceiling had to be raised because he cut taxes, so there was less income coming in. And then you follow up, though, and you could make the argument, and I'm trying to be fair here, you could make the argument that because of those tax cuts, then skip a president 4 years of George Bush and you get to President Bill Clinton. Clinton's administration was the first to balance the budget. You had the technology companies coming in. You have all of the income being made off of all the tax cuts that Reagan had instituted. And within 10 years, the Clinton administration actually had the first balanced budget in a real long time. So there's that counter argument of, tax and spend, or cut taxes and create more wealth, which then helps everybody in the whole trickle down economic theory that's argued by the Reagan believers. It's an interesting conversation. But back to the debt. Yeah, the debt went up when Mr. Reagan was president.
Now, in fairness, to both parties to disclose, even though Republicans have actually raised the debt ceiling, Republican presidents, more than Democratic presidents, the average percent increase of the debt ceiling is far greater when the Democrats do it than when the Republicans do it. Now, why that might be, you could do probably a whole show on that all its own. So we won't speculate too much on that. But the Democrats, on average, increase the debt ceiling by 16.8% every time they increase it, versus Republicans at 5.6%. So, it is a pretty substantive, almost three times the amount. The last thing to share is how many times has the debt ceiling gone down? Well, we said it's gone down 10 times. And interestingly enough, 7 of those times were Democrats, and only 3 of those times were Republicans. So when Democrats increase the debt ceiling less, but when they do it, they increase it more, and they're also more likely to reduce the debt ceiling than Republicans. So it's really, I guess the point in all this is, I guess what we're trying to communicate is it's really not a party-specific thing. It's very mangled throughout the parties and their history of the debt ceiling and how they use it and when they use it. And they both like to say a lot of different things about the debt ceiling, and a lot of those things generally are not very accurate when it comes to just historically. Again, the facts of what they have done, both Republicans and Democrats tend to not agree very well with what they like to go out and say publicly. So what do we do about all this, right? The debt ceiling is clearly not very effective, so we get rid of it. What do we do instead of the debt ceiling? Well, that's what we're going to talk about next. Keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. Since 1944, there have been 107 changes to the debt ceiling. That's a couple of changes, a couple adjustments to that original vision. And I think, Lance, even when you get into, just forget the decreases and increases component, which I think is an important component, just the fact that it's had to be modified 107 times since 1944, since it was put in place, I think tells you something about, clearly this wasn't thought through very much about how we're going to handle this on an ongoing basis.
Yeah, you just made the case of why the debt ceiling is such an example of a bobble. That if you have to change something that often in that short period of time, that obviously is not working very well. That's more than once a year, right? You're talking about the last 80 years and 100 and some changes. So it's more than once a year that we've messed around with this thing. It's never been partisan until the last few years. Before it was just like, yeah, here's what's, we're in agreement. We need to raise it right now because we got to keep the economy running. Oh, well, hey, wait a minute. It's time. We can lower it a little bit. All right, that's good. But now it seems to be, it's a big political fight like everything else. And
right.
It never has
Everybody
been before.
raises it, and
maybe now is the time to take a look at it and change it to a more effective way to deal with debt and to deal with our economy, instead of, since it's become politicized, It's all of us get a little shaky, I think, when we start playing politics with the economy, because that affects all of our livelihoods. I mean, more so than anything else to me.
Well, and for 50 plus years, Lance, our legislators have known that the debt ceiling is a nightmare, because in 1979, they created a rule that basically says the debt limit increases whenever the budget is passed. Now, that rule has since been suspended as a political maneuver, but that was passed with quite a bit of support at the time, because all the legislators are like, yeah, this is so stupid. We have to go through this all the time, and it doesn't really do what it's supposed to do anyway. So we're just going to put, rather than repeal it, because that would look politically bad, right? I mean, the headline would be, Congress eliminates the debt ceiling, and everybody throws up their hands. Oh my God, we've eliminated the debt ceiling. We're going to go out of control. And instead, what they do is they put a rule in place that basically eliminates the debt ceiling by saying, well, if you pass a budget, the debt ceiling just goes up to account for the budget, which again makes the debt ceiling null and void completely, right? Because if you're just going to move it every time you pass a budget, then you don't really have a debt ceiling.
I remember that argument. I was a high school senior the year that the Gephardt rule was discussed and passed. And it was at a time when there was some bipartisanship and let's fix this problem. And here we are 42 years later, and we still are dealing with it.
So as far as fixing it goes, and by the way, some of these ideas, a lot of these ideas come from both parties, but what we're referencing today is the No Labels Policy Playbook, and it's from 2016, and they did a bunch of surveys at that time to see where Americans were and try to come up with what are things that everybody agrees we could do that would actually fix a whole host of issues. Well, one of the things in there is their third goal, which was to balance the federal budget by 2030. How could you do that, right? I mean, how is that possible? Well, it actually includes a few things in there that are much better substitutes for the debt ceiling that would actually do more like what the debt ceiling is designed to do, but do it on a sensible scale. And the first one, Lance, and I think this is probably the most important one, is the Fiscal Responsibility Act. And that basically is the idea that we prohibit Congress from passing budgets that would increase the national debt as a share of the overall economy. The exceptions, of course, would be in cases of war, disaster, or recession. Because I think we all agree, I mean, Republicans and Democrats have said for a long time that, recessions and war and disaster are all exceptions where you may have to spend more money than you have available to make sure that you don't completely let the bottom fall out and send the country down the toilet, right? I mean, so with those exceptions in mind, generally speaking, you couldn't pass a budget that they could decrease the percentage, but you could never increase the percentage of debt relative to the size of the economy. So we all agree, whatever that percentage is, do you want it to be 20%, 50%, 80%, 120%? What do you want it to be? We say what that percentage is. And then the beauty of setting a percentage, right, is that as our economy grows and shrinks, that percentage doesn't have to change, but it changes the amount. So it fixes one of the biggest problem with the debt ceiling, which is that it's just a number, right? It's a fixed dollar figure.
Yeah, let's tie it to something. And if we're doing well as a country and we're making money, then the debt ceiling can go up. And if we're not, but you would hope now here's a lovely thought, that if we were making more money, you wouldn't raise the debt ceiling. You could if you needed to, but you would actually then start to pay off the debt so that when you go through a rough time, which as countries, as individuals, we do all the time, you have that cushion built up. You actually lower your debt during the good times. You don't go even further into debt. And that is what just drives me absolutely crazy. But what else did No Labels have to say about the economy, and how did people respond?
Well, the other thing that they came up with, Lance, and what we're going to do is talk about the ones that have the broadest support first, and then we'll talk about some of the ones. All of these have at least a majority support of Americans. But the next one is no budget, no pay. We have talked about this so many times. This one has the highest support, or no, Actually, I lied about that. It has the second highest support. 81% of Americans support the concept of no budget, no pay, which is really very simple. Congress, like literally one of the only jobs that's specifically spelled out in the Constitution for them to do, is to pass a federal budget, right? Appropriate the money for the country to spend. And I mean, I don't know about you, Lance, but most jobs that I've been at, if you have a deadline and you never meet the deadline, you're probably going to lose your freaking job, right? I mean, that would seem to be how it works.
Right.
But for some reason, for the past, 20, 30 years, Congress just seems to be able to get away with constantly, we can't get it done. So at the last minute, we're going to do a continuing resolution that basically just says we're just going to keep using the old budget because we can't figure it out because, we're too busy playing politics. And the real kicker is, right, they get paid. So the government, right, and the budget, it's not done, but you get your pay. You keep getting your money for doing what exactly? For doing not your job, right? For doing the opposite of what your job is. We're going to keep paying you. And there's no really repercussions for that at all. And I think two things. One, I mean, I would extend this further, right? Not only if they not pass a budget, do they not get paid until a budget is passed? There's no back pay. Absolutely not. I mean, you didn't get it done on time, right? You don't get paid. And the other thing is, if the government shuts down, Congress goes immediately without pay. 100% pay cut to all congressional leaders immediately, and no back pay when the government, opens back up. I mean, again, seems basic. You guys are the leaders in charge. If you're going to force this stuff to happen, then you should bear the brunt of whatever the consequences of it are. It shouldn't be, well, your lives are not disrupted and everybody else just has to suffer.
Well, one of the reasons I think for this bobble is that according to the Constitution, a budget has to be produced every year, right? So
interesting.
Isn't there also a question of, and I know that like in the state of Ohio, we have a biennial budget that we only do a budget every 2 years so that, for once the budget's passed, that this is the amount of money that your government entity is going to receive for the next 2 years. So what about that? I mean, maybe, okay, so because you're kind of coming down hard on Congress and you're saying, well, you people don't get this done every year like you're supposed to. We're just going to not pay you and you don't get any money. And it's like, well, but this is, federal government's grown since the Constitution was written. It's very difficult maybe to get this done on an annual basis. So what about the question of a biennial budget for the federal government, which is what there are many states that do that?
Yep. 56% support. 56% of Americans are in favor of a biennial budget.
So not as many as I would have thought.
No. And I think one of the concerns is that people feel like, well, what if something comes up, right? And then we're stuck with this 2-year thing and we can't make any changes. And that's a fair, at face value, that makes sense. It's like, well, crap, something happens and we're just stuck with what we have. Well, no, that's not really how that works. There would be all sorts of exceptions where they could modify the budget, which by the way, they can do now, just so everybody understands. That's really, you don't have to change anything legally. You can change the budget right now. They do it all the time.
So whether it's an annual budget or a biennial budget,
there's no change.
The same rules could apply.
Yeah, the same rules apply. The thinking is the whole process of getting it together, which we spend an immense, not only amount of time on, but forget your Congress people, right? But all the people behind the scenes that actually do all the work to assemble the budget, that's a monumental task. And we have to pay them every year to do that. And so it's an easy way to save money and avoid less of this fighting and time that our legislator spends on coming up with it. Right? Because they spend a lot of time fighting about it, a lot of time getting bogged down in it, and they could spend time, actually doing other things if they weren't so busy all the time fighting about a budget, which generally from year to year anyway, isn't a massive change. So that's part of where No Labels said, hey, this is maybe an idea that we should look at because it doesn't make a lot of sense to bog us down with this all the time when really, on average, all the times we remember, right, are of course the really big flashy changes to the budget, but most years it really doesn't change very much. It's pretty marginal adjustments to the budget as a whole. So There's a couple more things to talk about, though, and we're going to discuss what those all things that, have 70+% support among the American people. 7 out of 10 people support, 8 out of 10 on one of them. The highest one's yet to come. What's the number one thing the government could do to save some money, right? Maybe reduce what we have to spend all the time that we're not doing, that 82% of Americans support. What is that? Well, to find out, keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. A big federal deficit and a big federal debt limit. And just to be clear, Lance, we'll make sure people know the difference between those things, right? Because sometimes they get thrown around and I'm not sure that everybody's on the same page about what that is. The federal debt, right, is just the debt that the federal government holds. How much money does it owe to the people that it has borrowed money from? Just like how much debt does Lance has? How much does he owe people that he has taken loans from? So that one's pretty simple. The deficit, right, is the difference between how much we are saying we're going to spend and how much we bring in. And we operate at a deficit, i.e. at a loss, right? Therefore, we spend more than we bring in each year, so we have a budget deficit. Controlling those two things, there are different mechanisms for. And some of what we've talked about here, I mean, what this was in No Labels Policy Playbook is how to balance the federal budget by 2030. And what that would mean, again, just to be clear, is that the amount of money that goes out and the amount of money that comes in are at a minimum the same. And ideally, the amount of money that comes in is more than the amount of money that goes out, i.e. a budget surplus, right? Those would be the ideal situations. And in fact, there was an attempt a few years ago for a constitutional amendment that would have required Congress to only ever pass a balanced budget or better, right? So you either have to break even or you have to have a surplus, and you can never institute a budget that says otherwise, except for, again, in cases of war, national disaster, or recession. Those would all be exemptions to it. So this one, Lance, I mean, it's kind of crazy that we're not doing it, right? Buy in bulk. I mean, this is what big companies do.
Right.
They leverage their buying capacity. But we don't do that in the federal government, do we?
No, we do not. Pretty sad. That's a basic business tenet that companies all over the country take advantage of, and the federal government can't seem fit to get it done.
So in other words, if you're in one agency and I'm in another, we just go out to people separately and
if
buy
you need
stuff.
2 staplers and I need 2 staplers and the person down the hall needs 5 staplers, we make 3 different requisitions instead of the federal government saying, you know what, we need 7 staples. You just created 3 times the paperwork. 3 different people have to handle the order, and you probably don't get the price break. And of course, I'm making it very simple, but let's just say in the federal government, throughout the whole federal government, you need 200,000 staplers, and you need, 4,500 boxes of staples to get through the next month or whatever. And I say that because I used to work in an office supply warehouse. It's like, I know that our salesman would give you a lot better deal if you were ordering something like that, because we in turn would get a lot better deal from the company. Back then it was called Boss Stitch, where we got our staples. We would get a better deal because we were ordering in bulk. So when the truck would come in, we'd get it at a better price so our salesman could pass it on to the company at a better price. And that's something that everybody does, except for the U.S. government. Okay. So just makes you shake your head. It's just like, really?
82% of Americans support, buying in bulk because.
Well, hey, didn't Costco open up because of that? Right? I mean, I've been there a few times. Isn't that the whole concept? It's like, yeah, I only need like 2 cans of green beans. Hey, but if you go to Costco, you can buy a case of green beans and you save 3 cents a can, and people buy it, right? People buy memberships because they can get it cheaper. I mean, it's like, it's a concept that's been passed down to individual households, but the U.S. government doesn't seem fit to do that.
Another one, and I think this one's less talked about. I mean, these other ideas, right? We've heard people over the years talk about them, and yet they're not getting done. But this one, I think it's a big one. It's a really big one because right now we're talking about infrastructure, right? And there's this whole idea, oh my gosh, we're going to spend, trillions of dollars to fix the infrastructure, which again, in fairness, I think pretty much every American agrees we got problems, right? We got bridges falling down. We got roads that need fixed. The airports aren't in great shape.
Just listen to
Just listen
to Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg. He'll tell you he's trying to get as much airtime as possible to talk about all these things he wants to do with the infrastructure.
So, I mean, we all agree it needs addressed, but there's a lot of contention over trying to get this huge package through. Well, one way that this could be addressed is a capital budget to plan for long-term expenditures in infrastructure. So right now, right, we have one federal budget and everything goes in there, right? Social Security, Medicare, defense spending, infrastructure, anything the government spends money on, plop it in that big old budget, right? And that's what it is. And really, this idea has 70% support among Americans. And the basic here is that the federal government should be separated into two parts, the budget. A capital budget for long-term investments such as research and infrastructure, and an operating budget for our annual expenses. This is, again, a model that you will find that many businesses deploy, that many states and many schools and institutions all over the place. And it's the basic notion. Now, how you structure it's very important, but it's the basic notion that we have this pot of money over here that we budget for every year because we know we're going to have to take care of our, right? I mean, if we're a business, we're going to have to take care of our building. We've got to.
It's our cost. We know it's our annual cost of operating.
Yep. And so, we have to do these things. And then we also have all the stuff that's indicative to the business actually taking place, which varies from year to year. But we know things like at some point, the parking lot's got to get repaved. At some point, the air conditioner is going to go out. At some point, we're going to have to fix the roof leak in the building. Like at some point, we're going to have to do those things. So what we do every year is set aside money, even if we're not using it all of that year, so that it's there, so that we have it, so that we never get into what we're doing right now, which is this massive discussion about, we got to get all this money because things have gotten so bad that, now there's no choice.
Oh, you mean like households who create rainy day funds?
Emergency funds.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. You mean the American people have had all this figured out?
The American people can do it, but the federal
can't do it.
That's kind of what I'm saying. And my only, and I guess I see, and everything makes sense. So I would probably put myself in the 70%. But the 30% of me that would say no to this, like the American people did, they can't even handle doing one budget. And you're going to double the work? They got to do two now? I mean, they can't even get one done. How in the world are they going to get two done? Jiminy. I mean, come on. Incompetence reigns supreme.
Yeah. I mean, you can make the argument too that there should be like three budgets, right? Because you should separate the social programs that occupy such a huge portion of the budget that we don't ever touch into its own pot. But where does it end, right? I mean, how many do you do? At a basic level, the concept of this makes sense, but you wouldn't want to do this if you don't pass the other things like no budget, no pay, right?
Exactly. Yeah, it kind of all needs to be in one package. And again, unfortunately, we don't work that way, right? We pick and choose, and then we say, well, why doesn't it work? And I guess that was my frustration when I was in the working world, in education. We would find a program that worked, and people would say, yeah, but I don't like this part and this part. So we're just going to do these two parts and not do the other two parts. And it's like, wait a minute. Probably the whole reason that this idea worked is because it had four parts. If you just pick and choose, then it's not going to work as well. And then you go, oh, this didn't work out. Their idea wasn't that good. You didn't do their idea. And that's the thing here with no labels. These are all things that need to be done concurrently. They all need to be done at once. Picking and choosing might improve the situation, but we're not going to see a dramatic change. The way to do it, folks, is if you've got a plan, you go all in. And if you go all in, then you'll see the dramatic changes that yours truly think need to be done to fix this debt problem. It can be fixed. That's the whole point. It can be fixed. And wait a minute, the majority of Americans in 2016, the majority agreed that these fixes should be in place. They're supportive of them. Oh my gosh, if you want to get reelected to a government office, don't you want to represent the people? Don't you want to represent your constituents and do what they want? The majority of Americans said the things we talked about today said they wanted those things. So if you did them, you would be popular enough to win reelection. What a novel concept. Win because you get something done, not because you're going to complain about everybody else.
And fix one of the issues that's plagued us for the past 80 years, right? Mm-hmm. Which is the freaking debt ceiling, which, as we've established in this episode, is a bauble. It's totally useless. And in fact, I mean, arguably, right, costs us time and money and does nothing to actually prevent the federal debt from being increased. And the whole goal, I mean, just to be clear with everybody, Lance and I are in favor of controlling the debt. We've been talking about it for years. Every time it gets quiet out there, right, and nobody's talking about the debt anymore, we're here saying, hello, the debt, right? There's a problem here. You know, it just keeps getting bigger and we're not really doing anything about it. And that's a recipe for disaster. So we're all about the reduce the debt, you know, all about it. But the reality is the debt ceiling is a failure, right? It does not control the debt because the debt continues to go up despite the existence of the debt ceiling. So it fails at what it's supposed to do. There are ideas here that everybody agrees on that could succeed. I mean, at least they succeed in private business and in small government and basically everywhere except the federal government, because the federal government's the only one that seems inept and unable to do this.
And in your household and in my household, right, they work as well.
Everyday Americans are doing this, and the government isn't. So,
but that's what we do here at True Chat, right? Is we're trying to educate you by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've had one today about debt, and I think you all can see it because I know I can see it, and you're smarter than me, so we can do it. Why don't we hold the government, hold their feet to the fire, and make them do it? And get rid of this bauble called the debt ceiling. Hey, if you like today's show and you're talking to people about it and they say, well, where can I listen to these guys? This sounds like something that I'd be interested in. We tell them they can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The State of Us is available Tuesdays and Thursdays as a podcast first thing in the morning, and we can be heard in select talk radio markets around the country. I've got the final score today. Lance at 6. Justin at a lousy 4. So Lance takes another win. I think we need an all-time scoreboard somewhere here on the word of the day. Bobble, for those of you that don't remember. Oh, there's 5. Bobble was the word of the day. Oh, that's 6. I think we're tied now. So, and you know, we'll keep track of it, but I'm sure you all at home are keeping a close eye on it. So
those were bobbles of the word bobble.
No. I'm not sure. I think we have to like institute a cutoff point, right? In that way. Basically, once I've won, it cuts off, and then
that's usually the way it is around here, folks, just so you know.
For the State of Us on True Chat in Urbana, Ohio, I'm Justin T. Weller.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to our producer, Bradley Butch, and thank you all for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.